Thank you for being here. It's an honor to be able to share some of what I've learned along the way. I'm no longer an elected official, but I started in the Planning and Zoning Commission as an appointed official and then worked my way into the City Council through 5 two-year terms. My observations based upon this would be very hyperlocal, even though it's St. Louis County. There are 90 municipalities, if you're not familiar with it, and it's a challenge for the local media to keep an eye on all of us. And so sometimes things escape notice. One of the things that I really focused on, and we were just talking about this, is the lack of understanding on both ends of the Sunshine Law. I always advocated, not only is this obviously important to journalism and local media coverage, but also to individual citizens. And one of the things that I like to do when people were having a hard time getting information that they wanted, not whether anyone thought they deserved it, because that actually happened to us. There was a question, well, do you deserve this? But if they wanted it, they were entitled to it, no questions asked. And to avoid the argument about costs, I would just submit the Sunshine Law request on their behalf, which as an elected official and part of that body, I'm entitled to. Things like land use plans and state planning laws were something that were a major issue, and I found that reporters as well as citizens did not have a full understanding of the importance of these laws and how they worked. And the reason why that was important is because land use, rezonings, redevelopment, these happen right in our neighborhoods. And some discussions really are about, NIMBYism. Sometimes they're not. And reporters, I found, did not necessarily understand the difference between somebody who just doesn't like the look of a building versus someone who actually has a legal right to file a protest petition against a rezoning. And then the final thing I was going to offer up is that sometimes what is more important than what you cover is what you don't cover. Many things happened, which is one of the motivation for me running in the first place that I thought was just unacceptable. But because of the overextended resources, and of course we all know what's happened to staffing over the last 10 years in journalism, it's very hard. But when you pick and choose what issues to cover, pay close attention to what you decide not to cover, because it sometimes has ramifications not only in that community but in other communities as well. And we can go into more detail about that later, but that would be one of my suggestions and requests for this group. So thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Shawn?
Well, thank you. Well, as Scott mentioned, I've ran for school board 4 times, been elected 4 times, also had a city council election, and I was hearing Jonathan talking about he's about ready to kick off his election and started getting the gears running. And I was just kind of totaling it up. In the 5 different elections that I've been a part of in the campaigns, I think I've spent a total of $48 in all that amount of time. I come from a very small town. New Bloomfield doesn't really have a local newspaper. We are covered by a paper up the road a little bit by another town. But all of our campaigning, when it comes to that, is on the ground, door to door, signs, meeting and greeting people, kind of like the old-fashioned way of campaigning. And also, as Scott mentioned, previous to getting into education, I was in journalism. I worked for a number of different small newspapers and ended my journalism career here at the Columbia Tribune. And now that I'm not in the profession anymore, I'm a big fan of the profession. I'm a newspaper junkie. I know a lot of you, probably all of you, are newspaper junkies. And I always look forward to getting the paper. All the ones around me now, I look forward to going online and looking at the papers. And as Laura said, there's a lot of things from this side of the docket where we're at now. The things that we see that aren't getting covered, that are very complex type of issues, even in small town New Bloomfield, where our budgets are nowhere near what they are in Columbia or Jefferson City like that. We still have the same type of issues that are very complex and really hard to get down to. And that's the thing that I see missing the most, is the digging down for that additional information that really makes a difference in people's lives and in the decisions that they have to make when they go to the ballot box. That I wish that there was more opportunities that we could sit down with those that do coverage and really get to the point of what we're trying to do for our communities. And we're just looking for that understanding that there's a lot going on in schools and communities and city councils and on county commissions that get overlooked because it's not really the sexy story of the day, but it's extremely vital and extremely important.
Go ahead, Larry.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As Scott mentioned, I ran for school board my first time around running for an election. That was back in 2011. And I tell you what, I was absolutely petrified of the newspaper. But what I also found is, and Mr. Waters had pointed this out, and actually she's here today, Madeline LaRue. She actually from our from Jefferson News Tribune. She made me really feel at ease, and what she did in the type of, excuse me, the type of story that she ran was just basically meet the candidates type of a story. So she was able to allow me to get my story out and what my positions were, which I felt after that very comfortable with her. And so from that point forward, since my city council campaign and election, any types of issues that come up, I have no problem sitting down and speaking with her. She does most of our coverage, our city council coverage, committee meetings and thus and so. And so I just, I got really comfortable with her. During my campaigning, I never really had a whole lot of issues as far as what was said in the newspaper, what I meant to say or didn't say. But it's actually, as a candidate, it's really up to us to make sure that we get the information out that we want, because typically, speaking for myself, she'll print exactly what you say. I know I was telling Ms. Bryant during lunch that it was after I was elected that sometimes I took some issue with what was printed, because as a whole, we get blasted. And that's part of you guys' job, and we all recognize that for you all to be critical and bring some different viewpoints to light. So we don't expect anything to be biased or one-sided or anything like that. But we're human also, and so I think sometimes that human element of it, when we read the newspaper, read the editorial section, and read those comments, a lot of times our intentions aren't what is actually printed. But we understand also that that's the line of fire that we throw ourselves in as well when we run for a public office. So I'm totally comfortable with that. But then also it does kind of get to you a little bit at times, because deep down you know where your heart is and what you're trying to do to improve your community. But thus far, I would say I've had a pretty good experience. But it's one of those things though where you have some controversial issues when they arise. That's when it kind of the newspaper headlines kind of heat up, and so that's something that you definitely have to get used to with the media. And at this point, I'll actually be coming into re-election this year. I'm actually running unopposed. So that takes, I was telling my gentleman to the left, that takes some pressure off. And so looking forward to that, and looking forward to a bigger and better relationship with the media, as I think we have thus far.
Thank you. Jonathan.
As mentioned, I'm born and raised here in Columbia, Missouri, where we have more journalists per capita than anywhere. So you quickly, growing up in a community like that, I see every single one of the reports, like they lean forward to take notes right now, everyone from the Tribune, right? I'm seeing that. So you as a very young age, I was quickly kind of like, okay, there's always a journalist around. When I was, I just out of high school, I'm 18 years old, working a summer job before I go to Mizzou. I'm coming home, my family, we live in a little island of county that is surrounded by city. We have an interesting annexation policy here in Columbia. And so I'm pulling in, and these two young ladies walk up to me and they say, hey, can we ask you some questions? We're from the Columbia, Missouri. And I said, oh, sure, okay, whatever. And they wanted to know, it was about the 4th of July, and in the county, you can shoot off fireworks. In the city, you can't. My parents live in an island of county in the city of Columbia, so they can shoot off fireworks while all the neighborhoods around us cannot. So they started asking me some questions about this, and being young and impish and too smart for my own good, I'm making a lot of statements. Well, the taxes are different, provide some benefits, there's some drawbacks there, and we trash services, but we get city utilities. I'm making all these really great points, feeling really good about myself, and the article comes out the next day, and it's John Sessions, comma, 18, comma, loves fireworks, period. And so there was that moment where it turns out I ended up meeting this reporter years later. She's good friends with a friend of mine, and we reconnected. We're friends to this day. But it was just that first article. You're just like, okay. So there's always a little bit of trepidation when talking to reporters, and especially in Columbia, we have a lot of student reporters. And I know some of the professors have had myself and Karen and other local officials come in and talk to these student reporters and kind of in a similar fashion, what it's like to talk to a reporter, especially a student reporter. The juxtaposition between having the Tribune here in Columbia and then having the student side of things is there's a history that as you're on, I'm in my 4th year, I'm running for re-election for the school board, but beyond that, I've been actively involved in many city commissions and task forces beforehand. So you end up forming a relationship with all of your reporters, and all of these individuals are correct. They hold your feet to the fire, and they keep you honest, especially in a community like Columbia. But when I'm speaking to Andrew, who gets stuck like being in the comprehensive plan task force meetings with me, or Jody, who's in our EPA meetings, or Catherine, who's in our school board meetings, or Jacob, that's in other city meetings, and I know each one of those individuals' writings. I read them on a daily basis, and there's that relationship, so that I know when I'm having this conversation, I can be straightforward, and I know that what I'm trying to express will be explained with the manner in which I'm trying to get it across, and not necessarily like, oh, this is a great pull quote, but completely out of context and maybe not trying to get what I want across. An example of that would be the first time I ran for school board, I had we were in the middle of a transition for the Columbia Public Schools. We were moving our 9th graders into our high schools. Our 9th graders were not in our high schools. We were changing that. And I made a comment in my working with the youth that I had seen, I see 10th graders get that at high school level, and they mature very quickly. And I wanted to see us move 9th graders into the high school so that they recognize this is high school now. This is important. All of a sudden, my grades matter. I wanted to see that maturity happen a year earlier. And it's true. Moving them into the high school did that. The quote was something, or it wasn't even a quote. It was just a suggestion of Jonathan Sessions wants the 9th graders to move into the high school because they're immature. I know that was not my intention. I actually called the reporter, it was a student reporter, and I expressed, do you understand why I'm a little frustrated by this quote? Or this article? It wasn't really, did you feel that was really my argument? And I think that's the challenge that we have in Columbia, is that I know all of these individuals, and it's difficult to have that conversation with someone that I don't have that relationship with, and that's always probably the hardest thing for someone in my position, especially in a small market or small office like school board or city council. We're not politicians. We're local people that really want to help out, and we don't always know what that means when we're having that conversation for the first time with the journalist.
Thank you. Well, as you heard, I've been a commissioner for quite some time. I've had 10 elections, and I ran into Mr. Waters when I came in, and he said, "Oh, I didn't know you were here. I'd asked you a question." And I said, "Well, you remember the first time I ran for office?" And he said, "Well, barely." And I said, "You didn't endorse me." I said, "I remember that very vividly."
He didn't endorse me either.
I know, and I sent you a note and said, "Don't worry about it. It's not a killer." It's one of those things that that first election is really tough on the candidates, and you need to remember if they're a seasoned candidate or if they're a new candidate, because they're not used to responding, as Jonathan said, in a way that gets those one-liners really come out in those first campaigns, and you can scar somebody for life with your one-liners. I mean, people get where they don't even want to run because they feel like they were beat up in the paper, and that's not your intention, I know. It wasn't their intention when they gave the quote that it came across the way it did. So I would just encourage you to always watch kind of the ability of people to understand that their explanation is not fulfilled. If they give you a quote and it could go either way, please ask the next question so you know what the intent of the candidate was, so that you really do, you really are fair. When I was thinking about doing this, I was thinking about, after being elected, I want to compliment Scott Swafford. At the beginning of each semester, he typically brings all of his students over and we meet with the commission and we talk about what our responsibilities are, so that you don't have different students coming to you for issues that you don't even work on, that you aren't part of the nuts and bolts of day to day. And that gives them direction. And I think that's very helpful. And I noticed that many of these papers are small town papers. And if your reporter changes over, there's a huge learning curve. And from a county commission standpoint, I would recommend that you go and meet with the school board or go meet with the county commission and learn about what they're working on and things that you should be paying attention to. I really feel like we have a good relationship with both papers at this time in our community, and the TV station for that matter. I go to commissioner training meetings and 90% of the counties beg for somebody to come and write about what they think is important and their citizens need to know. They just don't get any press. Well, Jody Jackson's in our meetings every two times a week, plus our staff meeting. I mean, he's always following up, and we have a very good relationship. And so when there is something coming down, we make sure he knows about it so that he can get beefed up on the situation, so he can be very good at getting that message out to our citizens, because it's critical. So when I was thinking about a question I wanted to ask you, I was thinking, can you think back to something that you felt like you were you talked about it a little bit, unfairly represented, and what that did to you? I think that, and how did you handle it? So you get an unfair quote, you get an unfair story. Do you talk to the reporter and make sure they understood exactly where you're coming from? Do you just ignore it? My frustration is not with these people in this room. My frustration is with blogs, with people that don't look at both sides of the story and just print whatever they want as gospel, and people aren't aware enough to know that a lot of the bloggers do not do their homework and figure out what the real story is. They just sensationalize things. And so, I mean, so you could use that also. I think that's important, that we hear what some of the things are that might have not gone across so well and how you handled it. Laura, you want to start?
Before I answer the big question, my little comment is, my concern sometimes with not all bloggers, but some bloggers, is that they do their fact checking after they post the story, not before. And that creates
That's the bottom line.
many problems, right? My story is probably considerably different than everybody else's here. This isn't so much about the election, but something that happened soon after I was elected to my first term. The sitting mayor of Creve Couer sued 6 of us for libel and slander. I was a sitting council member advocating for my constituents, also sued the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce. I have another person sitting on the Land Use Citizen Advisory Committee, and there were several others. The end of the story is that the suits were dismissed. Oh, by the way, one of the 6 was also my husband. And they had to get it tossed because there really were no charges, but it was done for inflammatory reasons. And then another council member turned around and sued the same 6 of us again, using the same attorney who was the husband of the mayor. So it was pretty ugly. It was completely unfounded. The ACLU came in and made all the right arguments, and the whole thing got tossed. But not before, of course, there were some very juicy headlines. The way I found out I was being sued is I came home from work that night, and in the newspaper, there was at the time, a gossip columnist whose headline was that the mayor was striking a blow for democracy by suing us for libel and slander. And the fact that our local paper let that ride was devastating to me. And it was embarrassing because, of course, you know, I'm an old J school grad. I'm a big believer in transparency.
Was there no attempt to call you made by the?
Oh, no. This was, absolutely not. No. And to see, I still have a copy of that because I was so upset and so disillusioned by the editorial process. And it took a long time. A lot of people would walk up to us and say, "What did you do? You must have done something wrong," because there's no way the newspaper would allow something like that, even in a gossip column, to be printed that way and be worded that way. But the reality is it was manipulated behind the scenes, and it got by somebody. I'd just say, you know, be really careful and, yeah, call, double check, but honestly, I don't think he was much interested in our side of the story.
Thank you. Shawn?
Fortunately, I can't say I really have had a personal issue that's come up with any reporters. I learned a long time ago, probably before I even got into it while I was still a journalist, that never tell a journalist anything you don't want to see in the newspaper.
I agree with that.
And I can't say I've been stung by that. I probably learned that before I left the newspaper industry. So that's kind of something I've always lived by. Just if you don't want to see in the paper, don't say it, even if it's an off the cuff or anything like that. We did have an issue a few years back where we were holding a no tax increase bond issue. And the reporter got it wrong and called it a tax increase. And it's really hard to argue against something that's been in the paper, even though we can show all of our, they don't trust sometimes the brochures, the literature that the school puts out or the committee or something like that puts out when they compare it to what was ran in the paper. And even though later on that was corrected, it's just really hard to argue against that once it's in the newspaper. And that's really the only media that covers us. We don't get any television or radio or anything like that. So I just wanted to point that out, that was very difficult to get by. Now, we live in a community where they do trust us, and we were able to get through that and got the issue passed. But it was really difficult, and it really kind of broke down the trust that we had with the paper at the time. But those people have gone on since then. Like you said, there's a lot of turnover in small papers.
There are.
And some people it was just, that person just really understand that sometimes you take an issue to the voters. It's not asking for a tax increase. It's basically asking if we can borrow some money, and we're not going to raise taxes. And they just didn't really understand that process on the finances. So it was difficult for us to come through, and it really lost a lot of trust between us and the paper at the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And I think, Karen, you actually hit the nail on the head in that my issue has typically been with bloggers, and not with the newspaper. What they do is they typically get bits and pieces of what they hear around town, so to speak, or they'll get bits and pieces and pull from the newspaper. Then they'll write about it, and then they'll also send in editorial comments to the newspaper. And when you sit and read those sometimes, and rarely, I try to stay away from the editorial section sometimes, as much as, especially if we have some bigger issues going on, because I know that we're just going to get nailed in the editorial comments at times. But it's typically with bloggers, and what you get frustrated about is they'll put certain things in, and they'll quote you, so to speak, but they don't put everything in, and they don't, because what you're thinking is, that's not how I said it, that's not how I felt about it, but they put the smallest words in and turn them into a really big deal. And it's almost, and you really want to, at that point, you want to pick up the phone and call a newspaper and say, look, that's not what the position was, that's not how we voted on this, but obviously that's how it was interpreted with certain folks. And so for me, it's typically with bloggers. I haven't to this point really had an issue with being misquoted from the Tribune itself. And so hopefully that trend continues. But at this point, we're pretty used to the bloggers. And so you just kind of have to let them do their thing, so to speak, because there's not much you can really do about that.
It's kind of hard to respond back to them because then it's a tit for tat and it just goes on and on and on and you never end the story.
And that's clearly a no-win situation in the spot that we're in as well, so.
Exactly.
Yeah, I touched a little bit on feeling misrepresented before in the paper, and thankfully, I truly don't feel that's something that I worry about our primary paper here in Columbia that much with. I feel they do a fair representation of the school district and the other board members, as well as our city and our county. Bloggers are an issue that we continue to have. I think everybody's kind of touched on it, often posting things in a very, I don't know if it's a question, I never said it was true kind of way, which, we had a council member who had purchased a house in his ward, was going to move into it, was still living in his current house, and there was going, where's Councilman Schmidt? And it's like, well, you go by his house and he's not there. Well, because he's not living in it. Maybe you notice that it's like being dug up because it needs a new foundation. Yeah, it's those kinds of things. But you don't want to start that Karen's exactly right. You don't want to try to start that argument because it just kind of runs down the road. I had a run-in, my biggest frustration with it overall is that many of these blogs try to masquerade as journalism, and it's just simply not true. I shared a story the other day about there was one local blogger who, in my first campaign, sent the whole school board what he referenced as a press inquiry I call a scavenger hunt worksheet. And it's because he was actually after a county official and wanted the school board to give him fodder. And I sent a message back saying, this really didn't apply to education, but I'd be happy to answer some of his education questions. And he actually came out, I ran into him at church of all places, and he came at me, yelling at me outside of church, kind of shoving me on the arm because he didn't like my answer to his question, which right there shows just how unjournalistic many of those blogs are. And it's frustrating that there are people in our community, I know, that read them and listen to the conspiracy theories and think they're true with the limited to no evidence that's provided. But it's something we deal with. I just kind of learned to live with it and be okay with every so often a crazy guy is going to write something about me on the internet. What I will say, the one thing though, this is off the comment, there is one thing our local paper does that I'm not the biggest fan of, and I'm tempted not to say it because if you don't do this with your paper, I don't want you to think oh, that's a great way to get readers. The Tribune has a thing called Trib Talk, which is, you saw it coming, didn't you? And it is truly a phone number with an answering machine attached. I don't know who gets to type those up. Is that one of you guys? But it's truly people in our community pick up their phone when the light is, the yellow light's too short, or there was a bicyclist following the right of way, but why does that bicyclist have a right to be on the road? And sometimes it borderlines on hate speech. I'm frustrated that there's a venue in our community that someone can pick up a phone, ramble and rant into a voicemail, and it is then transcribed, sorry, not dictated, but transcribed and printed in our paper. I'm a little frustrated by that because oftentimes there are things about the school and the county and the city and beyond just there's a stop sign and I have to stop at it. Because some of the arguments are just that, why do I have to follow this law? I'm going to yell about it. But there are plenty of times where things that are said in there are factually inaccurate about the school district, about the county, about the city, but it's then printed and there's no rebuttal, there's no fact checks. Every so often, I will give Jim credit, he does say, if someone asks a question, he may answer the question, but there are oftentimes there have been blatant inaccuracies, and they have not been kept in check.
Thank you. You know, I think one of the things that it would behoove the journalism school to do, if your reporters are going to monitor local government, is to learn governmental accounting. It is very different than business accounting, and people get very confused. You know, if there are dedicated funds, you can't use road funds to take care of the police department or the fire department, and the reporters don't understand that. It takes a lot of time helping them to understand why you can't take this money and move it over here or whatever. And I just think that that should be part of your curriculum, is governmental accounting, because you're always going to follow your elected officials, whether it's the state elected officials, the local. Local's the best by far. There is no doubt about it. It's where the rubber meets the road. It's where you can see us at church and poke at us, or at the grocery store, or stop by the house. You know, I'm sitting out on the deck and somebody runs over and I got a question, you know, but that's okay. I like that. That's what I love about local government. You're accessible, and you should be. I think I want to open it up now for any questions in the audience. Young man?
Just talking about part of governmental accounting. You have a line for reporters when they're writing a story, calling you back for additional information. You have a way to respond. I'd like to see if we can do.
Okay, from my perspective, my email and my personal cell phone is on all my business cards, and the reporters can get me any hour of the day by email, and I will get back to them as soon as I can. But yes, I think you have to be available to follow up if you've had an interview. If you
Can you use your microphone for us, sir? Thanks.
Do they do it? Do the reporters, after they've had their initial interview, call you back for follow-up questions to clarify, make sure it's accurate? Do they do that?
The Missourian reporters do, because they're new reporters. The Tribune does not, but like I said, Jody comes to he has a very good grasp and understands our government and knows who to follow up with to verify something. And I have not been burned by Mr. Jackson, so I'm pretty pleased with his work, because I think he's fair. I'm not always happy with it, but I don't believe he ever misrepresented where I was at on an issue.
I not only had my email address and personal cell phone on business cards for the city, but also I put it on the website so that it was there when anytime anybody needed me. Reporters, like I said, sometimes it was very hard getting reporters interested in some of the things that were happening, although I thought they had huge ramifications statewide. Some reporters were more in depth than others. There's a woman, she lives somewhere in outstate. Her name is Florence Schinkel, and I'll always be grateful to her for writing about some of the things that were happening in Creve Couer. And she forced some things to happen as a result of the media coverage. It's sort of every journalist's dream to really make a difference, and she did that. And she was always very good about double checking and she wanted to make sure everything was accurate. Other reporters, they don't follow up. It depends.
I agree. Shawn?
I think your question was, do we have a policy within ourselves that we call the reporter back and ask after they've interviewed us? Is that kind of where you were going with that?
Not that. It's more that you're accessible for them to call you after the initial interview to go over things and double check them.
In my particular case, it's just very rare that I would ever get a call. I ever get calls about anything in particular from the media. But when I have, it's something we have to do, is make sure we return phone calls and answer those questions. I mean, we're better served if that reporter has a better understanding of the situation they're writing about.
Larry?
Pretty much in the same vein. I'm available by email, phone. Typically, our reporters are at our committee meetings and then our council meetings also. And so any questions that we ask of our city administrator or of each other, they're typically there. And what they'll do is afterwards, they'll typically go straight to the source, which is usually our city attorney or somebody like that who may have some better knowledge and have their heads wrapped around the situation much more. So they'll typically go to them, but we are accessible if they need us, and most of us are pretty good about calling back.
Jonathan?
Karen really nailed it. The Missourian they're learning. They always do quote checks and content checks. Don't give us a whole article to edit, but they do a good job of that. The Tribune, am I accessible, Catherine? Reasonably? Okay, all right, yeah. I tell you, my cell phone, all my information's online. If anybody ever needs me, they typically just call me and I answer.
Thank you. Shawn, you had a follow-up?
Well, I just wanted to add something. It's required by law that all new school board members have to go take 16 hours of training through the Missouri School Boards Association. And I remember as I went through that, there was a lot of things that I learned about it, and I always thought it would be a really good idea for whoever's covering local school boards to go to the MSBA and take that training. It's publicly funded. It's not like it's private, that people are paying for it out of their own pocket. So it's something that they could probably attend, or at least work something out with the Missouri School Boards Association to get that level of instruction and training that we receive as board members as well. So I would recommend maybe contact MSBA.
I went through that training as well, and
Yeah.
Catherine, have fun. You should.
Part of it, they do talk to us about how to relate and talk to the media and what we should say, what we shouldn't say, what should be held within, based on sunshine law.
Right.
And I think you'd be surprised at the advice that they give us sometimes.
I agree. You want to go ahead?
I agree with that suggestion, and I want to also endorse your comment, Commissioner, about the budget issues. I run a site in which students report on a small town, and the worst mistake we ever made was because somebody made a natural presumption about something in a budget, and I failed to catch it. These things can really redound for a long time. And it kept us from even getting a copy of the budget the following year from the mayor. We had to go to the Attorney General's office and make some law to get it. It really is important, I think, for folks to understand the rules of government budgeting.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, excuse me, I had a question for Carl about his travel expenses, but he's not here, so I guess I want to ask him about that. I did have a question for the Board of Education gentlemen, Shawn and Jonathan. There is some sort of statute, I think in our state, that school boards, if they have the exact number of candidates for seats they need, do not have to hold an election, which I find highly egregious and silly and against what we're supposed to be having elections for. I've written several editorials about this because I believe, and so I'd like their input, I believe that not taking away the right to elect or the right to write in leads to a very dark corner of backdoor things. At the MPA convention last year, there was discussion about a school district in southern Missouri that was talking someone out of running, so they could have two people to fill two seats, and hey, you just run next time, there's another seat open next year, why don't you wait that out, you go next year, then we don't have to spend $8,000 or $10,000 to run an election. I think it leads to intrusion, I think it leads to collusion, I think it leads to a lot of things that are not conducive to us saying we're an open society and we can vote on things when there's an election. There's two people to run for a seat, you two just get it. And we discussed yesterday in this room about write-in votes and the importance of having that option. And I've even seen it happen in a school board election in a very small town in Iowa that I covered. So I'm wondering, with all that lead in and how much I dislike it, and I've been accused of my school district and Lee Summit, by the way, I'm the publisher and editor of the Lee Summit and Cass County papers, of wanting to waste money, and I'm not looking out for the taxpayers because you want me to spend $10,000 to run an election that two people are going to win anyway. I think that's a dangerous way to look at it, and I'd like their input.
Jonathan, you start.
Well, I was, I think, an hour away from not having to have an election this year, and I am, which I'm okay with, and I was ready to have an election, and I agree with you that it should be on the ballot no matter what, even if it's just three, in this case, it's 3 people for 3 seats, it's 4 people for 3 seats in my race. But if it was just those open seats, I have no problem with it being on the ballot because it provides an opportunity for the community to have that discussion. We actually just came the previous year, we did not have an election. I fully recognize, and it's a little bit more to put it on the ballot here in Boone County than it is, than the numbers you provided. But I understand for smaller school districts, like $10,000 can be a significant portion of the budget, and that cost comes to the school district. It costs the school district money to put the items on the budget. So I understand why school districts, if they only have 2 people running for 2 seats, would prefer not to put it on the ballot. They find some cost savings there, but I'm totally for just having it on the ballot. I think it's a democratic process.
John?
I would say I 100% agree with you. I've even argued that with some of the lawyers with the MSBA who didn't make the law. It was done by the legislation. In New Bloomfield a few years back, we actually did have an election, and some people didn't really like who was running. We did have a write-in candidate win a seat, and she got reelected the next time around. That if that opportunity wasn't there, she wouldn't have gotten it. Now she's our board president. She does a good job, and I also believe, and I haven't seen any stats on this, that in some communities where this happens repetitively, that people lose the interest in the election, they lose interest in running because they don't see that every 3 years, the opportunity to have a discussion about who's on our school board. I do see that people don't even know who's on their school boards or their city councils and that, and I think it has to be out in front of people. And I think every opportunity that people go, their vote is their statement. Even if we know there's only 2 people running, there's 2 seats available, they're gonna win, a really low voter turnout might tell you some information about what they feel about what's going on, or the opposite. You might really get some good information if you get a lot of voter turnout, even though the election doesn't mean anything, so to speak. So I'm dead set against it, and I'd be willing to campaign to bring it back the way it used to be.
Well, I'd like to see Missouri Press Association take this up again, and sounds like we can count on both of your support publicly for that.
Well, the fire districts, the hospital board of trustees, the rural road district, they have the same kind of law. If they have 1 candidate and 1 seat, they don't have an election. So it's not just the schools. But I was just going to mention that in Ashland, we're going to have 2 write-in candidates in April because the 2 candidates that filed for election hadn't paid their personal property tax. So they were not eligible to be on the ballot, but both of them have since paid their taxes and have decided they're going to do a write-in ballot. So it should be interesting to see how that comes out.
I wanted to go back to the bloggers that you were talking about, and I should disclose that I've been a blogger. I've also been an elected official on the school board in our locality. But I was sort of surprised to hear the way you're framing blogging and citizen journalism and just the ease with which today any citizen could start an email list, point a camera at you, stream it online, create information in some stream, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, a blog, whatever. So do you look at those as opportunities to engage a constituent? And do you go comment in some way, maybe to start a conversation? I understand sometimes it can be frustrating and you feel like you're hitting your head against the wall, but do you see those as opportunities? And is it really the technology, blogging, or is it just that citizens now have more and more tools with which to engage you and challenge you?
I want to comment on that. We were doing a charter vote for Boone County, and one of my constituents thought I supported the charter, wrote a letter to the editor that they should impeach me from office, and so I knew he hung out at this little restaurant and had coffee every morning very early, so I was there when he got to the coffee shop with all his buddies, because he had never talked to me. He had just heard that from somebody and was mad, thinking I wasn't representing the county, that I was trying to be like the city, you know? And so I think you have to do that, but you can do that when you do it face to face, but when it gets into a blog where it's in writing, back and forth, you can't win. And if you know the person and you know what their temperament is, I think that makes a big difference. And, you know, the ones I've been exposed to here, I wouldn't engage with. But Larry.
And to kind of piggyback off of that, Karen, what I would say is, for that, it depends on the temperament of that particular blogger. If you can tell that they're very aggressive, sometimes it's just not worth the back and forth because you're not going to win. Now, I had a lady that called me. In this instance, she says, you know, we have an issue right now where we're voting on a conference center for Jefferson City. She calls me. She's an older lady. She ripped into me because she felt like I was a part of the group that wanted the conference center, and how could I do that? And she thought I was different from everybody else, and that sort of thing. And she really never understood my position. But once I spoke with her, and this was a phone conversation, once I spoke with her, and it was probably about a 30-minute conversation. She totally changed her tune. She says, "Oh, well, I didn't realize that. I didn't know that." Those conversations are much easier. And you let them go. You let them talk, of course. And then I said, "Okay, ma'am. Well, this is the situation." I said, "I understand your frustration. This is where I'm coming from, and you're hearing this exactly from me." But when it comes to the social media and the going back and forth, it's just really not. Most of the time, it's really not worth it because at some point, those conversations are going to get extremely heated. And then those conversations obviously get saved. And then those conversations can be sent somewhere or anything like. So those are just, for me, those are instances that I just would rather not engage. I may try to at one point, but if I feel like the conversation is just going to go into a very negative light, I kind of cut it off from there.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'm at the surface level not opposed to a citizen journalist that's operating like a journalist, but it really, you start talking about the tone and the temperament of those individuals who, you know, in our case, we have a few in this community, but will Photoshop pictures of you like it's Perez Hilton. One article was written. One article was written about me. It was claiming I was the mastermind. I found out that I was apparently the mastermind for some city ordinance that I didn't know was on the docket, and two was totally against. So I thought that would, and no one ever called me. No one never called, but I, never approached. No one ever sat down with me. There was no journalism there. It was somebody's conspiracy theory wherever they got it from, and they write it up with a Photoshop picture of me, and that's not journalism, plain and simple.
Laura?
So my story is just a little bit different. Because I mentioned earlier that sometimes we were hoping and praying for more media attention to bring issues to light. One of our citizens actually decided to do something about that, and he started a website. He started attending every Plan and Zoning Commission meeting as well as every city council meeting. And it was very simple. He called it crevecourvoter.com. And he did such a thorough and professional job that after a few years, he was actually awarded, the city gave him an honor, Citizen of the Year, for doing such a great job. He was his own editor, but he also double-checked everything. He was authentic, he was accurate, he was responsive, he was everything a professional journalist strives to be. So, it's possible. It's definitely possible. So I applaud him and everybody else who operates like that.
This lady up here.
For some of you, I know you're in your current campaign, but for those of you who aren't, at your last campaign, what stories do you think should have been done that weren't done by the reporter covering it? And, if you have those situations, are you comfortable maybe suggesting the reporter try covering this area that hasn't been dealt with before?
Anybody?
I'll take that on. We were faced with a lot of, every district in the state, faced with a lot of financial difficulties, and that was kind of the key to what I thought, what the candidates were talking about in our last election. And our coverage, we got a call from a reporter. They asked us about ourselves, how many kids we had in school, what our thing was, and I said, I want world-class education. Same thing I always say. But I would have really have appreciated some more questions and conversations about our finances. We live in an area that's not really comparable to everybody around us. We live in a school district that has no local business. So the majority of our funding comes from the state. And I would have liked to have had the conversation about how the state cuts have virtually crippled our district, how we're not able to offer vital services and vital classes that our children need because the state decided it was going to cut taxes and push that down. We could go out and raise our tax levy by $1 and not really make up enough because all we have basically are residents and agriculture. So I really wanted that to be the story of what we could do to combat that. But when we get compared to Fulton, Jeff City, Columbia, who all have business bases and totally different ways to finance their school, it often gets lost because we just get compared to the larger districts that are around us.
I think one of the things I really appreciate in an election is if you're doing your job and you're following that government anyway, you know what the top issues are. And I really like the side-by-side bars. Okay, this issue's coming up in the next quarter or next year. How do you feel about it? So you have both candidates or three candidates side by side what they believe, because then as a citizen who knows nobody, they can look at that and say, well, I resonate with that person on this issue, and so the majority of their issues I support, so that's where I'm going to look at supporting that candidate. And the thing they did last year, I think that was really good in both papers, was they made it very personal. They followed us for days, for all kinds of events. I mean, came to my house. I had a party at my house. The reporter was at my house, took a picture of me and my refrigerator with all my nieces and nephews on it. You know, I mean, they tried to relate to the public what kind of person I was, not just what my issues were, but that gives somebody a good place to start. They feel like they know you a little better and make you more approachable, I believe, when there's more personal issues involved. Anybody else here? Okay.
Only thing I was going to add is one of the things I struggled with was it's easy to say, where do you stand on these issues? What's harder, and this doesn't work obviously so well with somebody who's running for election for the first time, but when somebody has a track record, look at their track record. You know, if they've been standing up for things and taking some heat for it, pay attention to it because it probably says a lot about them and it means something. But if it gets ignored, then basically what you've got are two wish lists for two candidates. It's pretty hard to tell the difference between them.
Yeah, this is, basically a question for everyone but Shawn, because he already knew the ground rules going in since he was a former journalist. But, you know, as professional journalists, we have certain rules by which we conduct ourselves that, you know, is part of the profession and making sure that information is accurate and verifiable and that sort of thing. Talking on the record, for instance, is one thing. And it seems like a lot of times candidates, especially in small towns for municipal seats, things like that, sometimes necessarily don't understand that when you're talking to us, you're on the record unless it's explicitly is said, we are off the record. Did you guys have any problems with that? You know, did you sort of know going into it what some of these rules were? Also, another thing is like sometimes candidates will try to change quotes afterward, you know, things like that. You know, and they don't understand we can't change what you said. Did you guys have any problems with that? Do you think that it's probably behooves us to set out the ground rules ahead of time for candidates and, you know, whatever we're covering?
Larry.
I would say typically, anytime a reporter is asking a question, I always feel like I'm on the record. And so I conduct myself in that manner. I'm pretty much, and I was mentioning to someone this earlier today, that I'm pretty calculated in how I answer certain questions, especially depending on what type of issues are going on, because what I don't want to do is put out some information that may not be accurate at that point in time. So if it's something that I don't know or I can't answer at that point in time, I'll say, well, I'll get back with you on that. I'll be sure to do that. But typically, if I'm getting any sort of question from a reporter, whether it's been said on the record or not, or whether they say this is for the record or not, I'm thinking it's going to be on the record. So I'm already going into that conversation with that in mind.
With it's difficult to change the quote, and as you might imagine, I'm probably the most difficult person to pull a quote off of. Maybe not. I just talk too much as it is. Karen's laughing because it's true. So I know that it's often I'll try to get to a point and use too many words to get there. And I know that can be difficult to quote, and so then the part that does get quoted isn't necessarily what I wanted it to be, but I just kind of come to terms with myself on that. That's just something that I, as I've been doing this, have learned to better try to focus my statements so that, when I am sitting there having that record, but that conversation on the record, I know that I'm a little bit more cautious when I'm talking to a journalism student than maybe talking to someone at the Tribune who I have a relationship with. And it's, when there's that like kind of space between information for education to the reporter, and then, here's my thoughts and opinions in response to this information. So it's finding that line and trying to make what I'm trying to express, clear and which part is which. And I think I'd say that my relationship with the Tribune individuals kind of understand that. But it's just something you kind of always have to think about and be aware of. And if somebody said it earlier, if you don't say it unless you expect to see it in the paper. Yeah.
I like the fact that the students record. They'll say, can I record this conversation? That protects me as much as it protects them, and that sets the tone. All this is open game for this article, and I think that is good, especially for new people, because that really sets them in line that, yes, this is recorded, so that means that whatever you say is going to be used. So that's just my thought.
I'm originally from Oklahoma City, and so probably most of you haven't heard, but we're having a mayoral race this year. And so one of the big issues is the line between personal information, which is something we've talked a lot about today, and what shouldn't be open to public record. So our challenger, his divorce records were unsealed. And so it was requested by our big newspaper, the Daily Oklahoman. And so I was wondering if there is a line somewhere that you think shouldn't be crossed by journalists when it comes to personal matters.
Who'd like to take that one on? Why don't you, since you're in this sunshine role?
Obviously, I don't think we're actually talking about transparency and sunshine laws here. I guess as a human being, I would ask, what was the point of requesting such information and what was its relevance? It's hard to imagine what that had to do with anything. And to me, I'm an old J school grad. So, I take these vows, I think that's what I equate it to, very seriously. And I think when you cross the line, it taints everybody. So I don't know the circumstances, I don't know the details. It's hard for me to understand why that would be necessary, why it would even be desired. Maybe there's a reason, but.
There were allegations of large amounts of illegal drug use, and so they were trying to extract that information just for qualification.
Okay.
Anybody want to expound on that, Shawn?
Shawn, you want to go for it?
Yeah, there's a line. I believe there is a line, especially when they start talking about other people, family members, other people who you might have been associated with. But I think when it comes to me or the candidate or the person who holds the office, you're pretty wide open because you're asking people to trust you with a lot of money and a lot of other issues that really maintain their life. So, when it comes to me and what might have happened in my background or something I have said in the past, and you're going to compare that and you're going to fact check or background check me, I think that's fine. But if you were to go and maybe look at something my children done or my wife had done or something like that, that would be across the line, I would think.
Jonathan, do you have something else to add?
We have CaseNet here in Missouri, which, I mean, to some extent, even divorce proceedings are on there, which I've always thought was kind of interesting. So you can often find like the alimony payments, all public records. So I always thought that was interesting, and it comes back to the relevance. My partner is the executive director of a government entity here in this community, and there is, plain and simple, been an article on the front page of the paper about our relationship and the potential of a conflict of interest while sitting on different commissions together. And it's something that it is what it is, and I know in running for school board, opened myself up for that. And there's probably some moments where I'd be, if those kinds of things were going on, I'd be a little frustrated. But I recognize that, it's part of it's the other half of being the public servant. It's being in the public. So.
Anybody else? Go ahead, Scott.
I would just remind you guys to think about it the same way Mark Corbett was recommending this morning. I'm probably going to look at those case files and see if there's anything in there that's pertinent to the actual election. If there are allegations of heavy drug use, now we all know in divorce proceedings it can get really ugly and things that aren't necessarily true get bandied about. But I'm at least going to look at that file and see if there's anything in there that's pertinent. And if it's not, I'm going to move on and not feel slimy about having done it.
Larry?
Well, I was just going to say, personally, I do feel like there's a fine line. But again, we open ourselves up also when we do run for public office. And so certain things, I kind of think should be off limits, but then at the same time, you have to, it is a fine line, definitely.
Before I put my name on the ballot, I worried about what's the press going to do to me? I called Governor Wilson, who is a personal friend. I said, okay, what are my issues you think the press is going to deal with? Well, you own a bar. No, I own a restaurant. I was Restaurateur of the Year last year. So I could go through everything he threw at me. I could go through how I would respond to the press. But I can tell you that was a fear that I had to get over before I put my name on the ballot. So you guys hold a lot of power with people, and we don't want to make it such that people are afraid to run for office. We want more people to run for office and to consider it an honorable job. I love this work because I know every day what the decisions we make have an effect on our people right here. They're going to feel it, good or bad. So if we do something bad, we're going to hear about it because they're going to feel it in their everyday lives. And that's the value of local government. Jody?
This is a comment or maybe an observation about sunshine that I'd like your perspective on. In the length of my career, I have always viewed sunshine, as most journalists have, as simply an avenue of transparency for local government. But it's been my experience that a lot of local government, a lot of elected officials think sunshine is simply a shovel for the press to use to dig up stuff. And I'm not saying that that's what everyone believes, but in the way that I learned sunshine, the way we discuss it in our newsroom, it's really a way for public officials to protect themselves. That you understand that you follow, transparency and these basic principles. That's simply the way to conduct yourself. And that sunshine is primarily for the citizenry to make sure that they're keeping government accountable. I'd just like to hear maybe some discussion about when that becomes a point of contention with the media that cover you.
Larry?
Yes, the good old sunshine law. Well, and it's, that's an excellent question. There's quite a few of us that have our opinions about the sunshine law. Quite honestly, but it's one of those things where, and it was mentioned earlier, don't write anything or email anything that you don't want to come out, because it typically is going to come out. We had this situation come up last year, I believe, with our former city administrator. There was an email that went out from him to all of us, and I think also the city staff, and then it was later on requested by the newspaper. And all of us kind of cringed because it was something that probably shouldn't have been sent in an email, but it was. And so that was, those were questions that we had to answer to. But again, it was one of those situations where we were also protected by that as well, because it didn't come from any of us. It didn't come from any of the council members. It came from our former city administrator. So we dealt with that, dealt with the fallout from that for a few weeks. Yeah, it's, I don't mind it at all because, like I said, it is, like you mentioned, it is for our protection as well. That's just like when we have closed sessions for our city council meetings, we have closed sessions. Within 72 hours, that information has to be released. Typically, obviously, how our votes go and things like that. And so I'm fine with it. But you do have some other elected officials that simply just don't care for it at all because they do think it's a shovel for journalists. But I'm okay with it.
Jonathan?
I definitely want this to be wrapped up by the sunshine expert, so I'll share my thoughts before I go, or before you go on. I love sunshine. Sunshine's great. I think we continue to progress to make it a better law. I know there are a couple things that have been discussed that we might see this session actually to improve the sunshine law. I'm sure there are individuals that are concerned about it. I mean, they sunshine my emails. It's a bunch of boring things, mostly about scheduling meetings. But I'm okay with that. What I do recognize, because it exists, I know that most of the time I suggest to journalists to just ask. I mean, the Sunshine Law puts a lot of processes into play, and it can be a very staff time-consuming element because you have to do things in very orderly manner. And there's never been a time that a document that's public has been requested that it has not been provided. And so I know there's the Sunshine formal process, but in a community like Columbia, we are more than open, and we're always wanting to make sure that anybody has what they want. So it's easier for us if you just ask and we can just gather it. If we're going through the formal process, printing all that out, it can just delay the process. It takes more time, but we're open to it, and we think it's a great law. And because it exists, I think it keeps communities. It's designed to keep everybody honest, and that's why I like it.
Shawn?
I'm going to answer that question in this room, really? Just kidding. Well, like I said, I come from a different perspective, and I think it's extremely important, just for the reasons you said, to kind of protect ourselves. I know that the Missouri Press Association, in the last session or previous sessions, has advocated that we record closed sessions in our meetings, and I have no problem. I would have no problem with that, with the understanding that there are some things that we are bound by law to protect those conversations when it comes to personnel or real estate or legal issues like that. I personally, during our closed sessions, use the Sunshine Law to just speed things up, because a lot of times side conversations will start and things like that. And with my background, I'm able to do that, keep the closed session going. But I do fear that in a lot of other similar situations like ours, that there's a lot of things that go on in closed sessions that probably should be discussed in the open and must be discussed in the open. I believe, probably like everybody up here is going to say, that we're open, that we do follow the Sunshine Law. I believe that full-heartedly where I'm at, but I do fear that it's not followed that well in other places.
I'm going to talk for an hour about the Sunshine Law. My experience in the city of Creve Couer is a little bit different. The issue has never been journalists asking for documents. It's been citizens and me asking for documents. And I'm just going to share these two little episodes which are intertwined. We actually had our former city attorney state that emails were not considered documents, public documents. And the reason why this was relevant was we were in the middle of drafting a land use plan. We were trying to figure out how certain recommendations were just suddenly appearing overnight. They had to come from somewhere. So we started asking for that. Meanwhile, draft after draft was appearing. So then we asked, well, let us see the first 2 drafts, because we couldn't figure out how we were getting from A to B. And the city attorney again ruled that the consultant, which operated in another state, they had copies of the marked up drafts off-site in another state. Well, they were not subject to the sunshine law because they were no longer within the filing cabinets of City Hall. That went on for a year. I was begging for somebody to pay attention to this issue as this went round and round and round. There were recommendations in there about using eminent domain to redevelop a local business. There was absolutely no explanation of where that came from. And fortunately, remember, I was singing the praises of a former journalist by the name of Florence Schinkel. Finally, she paid attention, said, what is going on here, and why is nobody writing about this? So she wrote the saga and documented, and the city administrator confirmed that the city attorney had indeed told him this. We had a pending request with the AG's office, which had been held up for almost a year. And as a result of her 2 articles, that opinion came down, and of course it stated the obvious, and which is you better release those land use plans, those drafts, because it doesn't matter whether they're in Ohio or in Creve Couer, they're still public documents subject to the sunshine law. My only point is, obviously, we're sitting in this venue, but the sunshine law is for all of us. And sometimes, it's not a journalist, it's an elected official. Sometimes it's someone who's a committee member. Sometimes one of the people that I got to know very well, who ended up being a very close colleague of mine, the way I met her, she knocked on my door and said, I have asked the city planner for a copy of the current land use plan, and he says he can't find one. And he said, I heard that you might have one. And I said, oh, come to my basement, because I have copies of everything. And sure enough, I pulled it out, and I said, here, and she said, why can't I get one at City Hall? And I said, I don't know, this is part of the struggle. I tried to make the process as painless as possible, but the sunshine law exists for everybody. And I know I sound a bit over the top with this, but I really believe it.
Well, you've had problems, and I can understand why that is important to you. And in our county, because we have so many journalists, we go overboard on posting, this is who we're meeting with or whatever, and it's for our benefit. I mean, then Jody knows, well, that's nothing that I need to worry about, but this one is, because he follows what we do. I mean, and I think that's really valuable. The thing that the sunshine law drives me crazy about is having a 3-member body. So we can't even talk to each other about something without being in violation, except. Because you're a quorum. Yeah. But if it's administrative, we can, according to the Attorney General's office. He came and gave training to all of our boards and commissions and stuff. So if there is a culvert in a road that has a problem, and the liaison commissioner says, we need to get somebody in here to fix this, if we didn't have the staff to do it or whatever. He could talk to us, because that's an administrative issue. We need to get it taken care of. But as far as, well, what are we going to do about this, or what are we going to do? That's not part of our world, We have separate offices, we do our own thing, and it's just the way life is. We've learned to live with it, but it is very hard in a 3-member body. Well, we need to wrap up, so if you have any last-minute comments, but it's like less than 1 minute. I'll start with Jonathan.
Thank you.
Larry?
I would also echo those sentiments. Just thank you. Thanks for being here, and thanks for having me also.
John?
What they said.
Laura?
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having an interest.